Everyone, welcome back to AEG's podcast. Today we have a very special guest that I'm sure you're all aware of who this will be, Mr. Jay Martin. Thank you so much for joining us, Jay.
It's my pleasure, Catherine. Happy to be here.
I'm so glad you're here, and thanks for sharing your bio in advance. We'll ask everyone to go and take a look at the deep dive on that and all the good things on your internet. And I get your newsletter too. I absolutely love reading it. So keep up the good work.
Thank you. I love writing it. It's the highlight of my week, to be honest. Yeah, of
Oh, well, I can see that. Yeah, we can feel your passion right through it. So thank you for sharing it always.
course.
Awesome, Jay. Well, thank you. I'm very curious. How has media changed in our lifetime, and is this advantageous?
Well, it's advantageous to me as a media creator, right? The barriers to entry have been diminished to almost nothing, and there's obvious pros and cons to that. So, you know, there's no shortage of content to sift through anymore. And the benefit to that is that independent journalists all have a shot, right? We all have a crack, right, at getting our voice heard, building a platform, building distribution and an audience. We have a good shot at getting amazing experts to come on our programs because costs have come down to zero for a lot of those exercises. And the challenge, obviously, is like, how do you know who to pay attention to, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's been a lot of shifts in the Canadian media landscape, and maybe I'll focus on that as I'm out here in BC and you're in Alberta. And a lot of the funding, I suppose, that's been granted to a lot of our legacy media platforms has skewed the narrative in a way that I find myself needing to be a bit cautious of. And I'm all for the right subsidies in the right directions and supporting Canadian industry as a competitive vertical. But, I think when subsidies get out of hand, you have to question the incentives of the media platforms that are receiving those. And so, in Canada right now, I think we're in a bit of a precarious time where we've seen just record amount of cash distributed from 2019 forward to very specific media platforms that have to meet a certain kind of criteria in order to receive those funds. And typically what that means is they have to be larger, broad distributors of news. So no sole proprietors and no special interest news platforms, which excludes any independent journalists from receiving those hard dollars, but, obviously wraps up the biggest media platforms in the country into that.
Yeah.
So we've added a bunch of firepower to, I would say, a group of media distributors that are quite aligned in their political views.
Mm-hmm.
And that's created a bit of an imbalance, I would say, in Canada right now. And it's not good or bad. It's always been, right? Governments have always influenced media as best they can, back to the Roman Senate. I mean, it's not new, but it does add a layer of, I think it requires an extra layer of caution for the Canadian media consumer, which is good, right? It's good for us to be reminded that no one's got our back and it's up to us to find our own best interest, right? And if we're navigating a bit more of a confusing and I might even say treacherous media landscape than we were 10 years ago, let's get better as a consequence, right? Let's get better at cutting through the noise, getting to the signal, doing our own diligence on who we're paying attention to. It's so important in any bucket of life, not just media consumption, but to just take ownership again, right? And take accountability for who we're allowing to influence us. And, and the other side of that is it's so good to listen to the opinions that offend you and you disagree with and challenge your assumptions and all of this. It's the way you form better opinions and stronger opinions. And if you don't ever have your assumptions challenged, then you're just probably laced in blind spots and vulnerabilities that you never have to deal with. So, that's a couple thoughts on that for sure. I think, in general, it's good. It's a net positive. The access to platforms and the access to independent journalists that on platforms like Substack now, podcasts, obviously, YouTube, obviously. And we're seeing more of a rise, I think, in the US right now with journalists like Matthew Grenwald and Matt Taibbi and Heather Cox Richardson. She's the biggest publisher on Substack, I think over 5 million readers. Just a journalist with now a multi, she's probably doing somewhere around I don't know, high eight figures, right, in revenue. And this is just a very talented author who's just crushing it. And it's so good to see. It's so inspiring to see. And I think that's going to continue to spread. Like that door is opening now, and more people are participating. But we still have some legacy overhang to just deal with, right? Nothing wrong with that. Just good to be wary of it and aware of it, I suppose. Yeah.
I agree with you. And I love your positive attitude around all of this. One of your newsletters actually commented on the amount of money that was given to different media. I think it was a Canadian number. It was a big number. I forget what it was. Maybe you can share a little bit about that. And also one other comment I'll make is that when my dad was alive, he always said, there's always a bias and there's always motivation with why people are doing whatever it is that they're doing. So whatever we're learning, it's up to us to go deeper and figure out why. What is their motivation? Who's paying them, if there's anybody paying them? And then why are they trying to do and teach us whatever it is that they're teaching us? So do you mind commenting a little bit about all that?
Yeah, it was a Canadian number, and I believe it was $719 million that have been granted to Canadian media outlets since 2019, which for Canadian media is a really large number. It's a number that makes a difference, and it really makes a difference depending on who it's allocated to. I mean, that can change the life and the business trajectory of hundreds of independent journalists. Unfortunately, it didn't. As I mentioned, it was gifted with some very specific parameters. And I can't remember the exact wording on the 2 bullet points that excluded independent journalists. But essentially, it did eliminate any sole proprietorships, and it did eliminate any special interest news platforms. So if you just wanted to talk Canadian politics, for example, you would not be eligible for any of this allocation. The curious part to me was 600 million of it was handed out under the guise of assisting Canadian media platforms to modernize into the digital environment, right? This means to catch up, right, to the way media has been distributed now. Obviously, if you were in print 20 years ago, you're no longer relevant. You've got to be competitive in the digital landscape, which is kind of, you could sell that, right? Like, oh, it makes Canadian publishers competitive in the global marketplace because they're going to receive all this money to digitize their business. And if you don't think hard about it, you're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Let's do that. That's good. And then you remember this happened in 2019, not 2003, right? It's 2019. We haven't figured it out yet. Like, I don't know, right? Survival of the fittest here. Like, why float the dinosaur when there's so many talented young journalists coming up who already, I mean, they're cutting their teeth in this new world. They've got it figured out. They're already competitive, right? Imagine what they could do with the firepower of Canadian government subsidies. But instead, we're floating the dying industry for just a little bit longer. It's not like they're going to throw, $1 billion at them. They're not going to figure it out if they haven't yet. It's not a money. It's an innovation problem. I've had a couple of media titans on my show, one being Lord Conrad Black, who, say what you want about him. He's had some controversy, but, he did build, a $3 billion media empire in the days of print, saw the winds changing and got out, right? And Steve Forbes, another who I've had on the show here and interviewed at conferences. And that's the Forbes media business is like a 117-year-old business. Like, it's a 3rd generation company. And Steve Forbes is probably in his late 70s at this point. And this business has quintupled their value by digitizing, right? And he saw the winds changing and adjusted the platform, took a lot of heat for it. I interviewed him on stage last summer in Las Vegas. And another panelist was still giving him grief for not publishing his monthly magazine anymore. And he's like, what do you do? And, so all that to say, like, every entrepreneur, it's up to us to navigate an ever changing landscape. And I just, it doesn't just bother me a little bit that we're floating dinosaur industries. It does make me concerned how the money is distributed, because it, obviously comes down to a third party discretionary committee who determines which media platforms will receive this funding. Well, who appoints the committee? It's the Liberal government. So if you want some of that money, who do you have to stay on the right side of? The Liberal government. So what kind of stories you're going to write? Those that keep you in favor, so that you're in favor of the committee, so you can receive the funding. Like, and this isn't, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I think I'm a pragmatist, and I just follow the money. I mean, you don't have to believe in conspiracy theories to understand incentives. I mean, you just said it, right? This is what your father used to tell you. Just follow the incentives.
Yeah.
Good, bad, or otherwise. Like, that's how we operate. My employees operate based on the incentives I put in front of them, right? I operate based on the incentives I have in front of me. I protect my bottom line and my family's livelihood. And if you're floating $1,719 million in front of me, I'll write whatever story you want. I mean, hopefully not.
I actually don't think you would, based on what I know about you.
But what I'm trying to say is, it's not that complex, right? It's quite a simple thing, right? You put the carrot in front of the human being. Don't be surprised if they take a bite of the carrot. I mean, that's what happens, right? Yeah,
that's right. Human nature. Thanks.
Human nature. It's timeless, right?
That's timeless. That's right. Thank you. And how about navigating the fear mongering on the daily headlines? We touched a little bit about, how we discern, but what's your advice around the fear mongering?
Well, fear sells really, really well.
Sure does.
And I battle with this myself as a publisher, because we put out 3 videos on our YouTube channel a week, I think the same amount of podcasts. And then obviously I publish a weekly essay. And I know what kind of thumbnail and title will generate a higher click conversion. And it's the sky is falling.
Yeah.
I use words like crisis and collapse and crash. Like, I just know it's going to perform better. Right. And obviously media recognizes that and leverages the heck out of it. And it drives my team nuts that I frequently, I want to love the product we produce. I want to be proud of the platforms that we own and the content we create. And when sometimes when I get a thumbnail back from my team and it's just like hyperbolic sensationalism, I know it's going to work, and I know they're doing their job. They're incentivized to get clicks. That's what the editing team is there for. But I just feel icky, and I have to undo it. And otherwise I'll be embarrassed to send people to our own platform. So, we know it works. We know doom and gloom works really, really effectively. And if you look at the media landscape, it's largely a volume game, right? Most publishers are putting out 4 or 5 headlines a day, especially the free ones, right? If you're reading free news that's ad supported, they got to keep you on the platform as many times as they can get you per day. And so they'll find as many sensational headlines per day to keep you coming back. And even, pay to play platforms, like I subscribe to the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg and Reuters and a couple others. And I appreciate the news that's not so ad supported or ad incentivized, but even they have a mandate to put out a morning headline and an afternoon major headline. And I just don't know if there's 2 major headlines in a day, every day. I don't think the world is that interesting, to be honest, but if you got to find them, you're going to find them, and you're going to take whatever story is percolating that morning or that afternoon, and you're going to make it as sensational as possible to capture people's attention, because that's what you're incentivized to do, right? And they do a great job of it. So how do you, as a consumer, defend yourself against that, right? And one thing, I don't have the answer, but one thing that I do is I have a collection of authors and publishers that I trust. They're on either side of the aisle. They often disagree with each other, and I enjoy that. But most importantly, none of them publish daily. One of them publishes weekly. A couple publish weekly. A couple publish monthly. One of my favorites, she publishes every 6 weeks. And then a couple reports that I consume quarterly, and they're huge, but they're quarterly. And the benefit to that is that nothing determines what's real and what's not better than time. And I think that the most likely outcome for a morning headline is that it's irrelevant by the afternoon. I mean, that's the most frequent outcome, and the same for the afternoon headline the next morning. But if a headline survives until somebody's weekly wrap up, well, then it's got a bit more substance than those, twice dailies, right? If it survives to somebody's monthly recap, even more legs, even more substance, even more robustness, right? Probably there's something more important going on there. And, quarterly, even more so, annually, reviews, even more so, right? It's really tempting, especially when the world gets busy. Like think of these bank crises that we watched over the last few weeks, starting with SVB and then Signature and, just on and on and on. And it's so tempting to just follow the minute by minute. And I was in Bali during this. And so I would go to bed when New York wakes up, meaning I would sleep through the entire news cycle. And when I'd wake up and New York is going to bed, I will be so tempted as soon as I open my eyes to open my phone and find out, like, what's the latest, like, did Credit Suisse get bought out? Did they go under? Is Wells Fargo next? Like, what's going on? Did the Fed pivot? Whatever it is. And it's fun. And I think it's just important to remember that if you want to follow headlines that closely, just remember it's kind of like watching sports, right? It's entertaining, it's fun, but it's not consequential, and don't lose your mind in it, right? Because we're not going to be talking about most of those headlines in 6 months, probably any of them, to be honest with you. Nothing really of consequence occurred.
Sure.
Maybe some new policy on bailout activity, but like the individual names, they're going to be forgotten, and they're of no consequence. So it's like, I think recognizing that it's a volume game, recognizing that all media platforms are incentivized to scare you. The best thing you can do, the best thing I can do to protect myself from that, like, reactive ping pong of like the flight or fight response that I might get from scary headlines, is just to step back and do nothing. Maybe, let things sit. It's called the Lindy effect, right? The longer something has been relevant is a good predictor of the longer it will be relevant in the future. And, so those morning headlines that have been out for 2 hours will probably last about 2 hours longer. That's a good prediction. Not infallible, but it's a good prediction. And if a headline's still relevant a week later, that's okay if it's scary. I mean, some headlines are scary, but give it time. Let it settle, right? Let it combat the next 11 headlines that are going to come out in the next 4 days, and see what's standing when the dust settles. Even 7 days later, it's not a long amount of time. Don't read the news daily. Just don't do it, right? It's a fun experiment, I found. I can be in it every day. Wall Street Journal every morning, Twitter all afternoon. I can do that. I don't feel great. I feel really angry and angsty and just reactive.
Yeah.
And then if I'm buried in a project and I'm not paying attention to headlines, my life doesn't get worse.
Right.
I'm not suffering from knowing less, at all. Right. It's
at all.
At all, so what's the downside? It's entertainment media more than it's journalism most of the time. Right.
I agree.
Yeah. And it's beneficial to find the horses that you really trust and enjoy and stick with them, Yeah.
I agree. That is, and you're my horse. Many of our horses.
Appreciate that.
No, it's true. And when the lockdown happened, and I used to be one of those, I would check headlines all the time, and I was on the news morning and night because I actually thought that was what I needed to do to engage with the leaders that I was dealing with all the time. And then it turns out I was doing what you were suggesting during the lockdown. I found it to be the exact same thing, and I couldn't listen to one more COVID number one more time. So we actually shut it off. Neither of us actually watch the news at all anymore, and I'm much happier.
Yes, good for you. That's an important lesson. Yeah.
And thank you for your advice. That's awesome. Well, go a little deeper, if you wouldn't mind, with regard to your feeling and your thoughts around the overall performance of Canadian media.
Well, I'll use a recent example. We've recently seen some pretty important, not so recently anymore, but some pretty important legislation come forward, both in Alberta and Saskatchewan, being the Alberta Sovereignty Act and the Saskatchewan First Act. And so, how do I think Canadian media performed in covering those announcements when they were brand new? And I couldn't believe the bias and the one-sided coverage of each of those pieces of policy. And I was fortunate enough to sit down face to face with Brad Wall, the former premier of Saskatchewan, for an hour and walk through it.
He's amazing.
He's amazing. And the way, he outlined it, he's like, look, we're not asking for changes. Actually, we're asking for our present existing constitutional rights. That's it. That's all. That's all we're asking for, And this is in response to federal creep into decision-making that has historically never been federal. It's been provincial, right? And so we've been pushed up against a wall, and we're just trying to get our room back. That's it. If you look at the media coverage, it demonized the leaders. It demonized Danielle Smith. It provided these incredibly dire outlooks for the future of the provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan, and claimed that none of the citizens within the provinces wanted this legislature, right? And like 3 days later, the Saskatchewan First Act passed with unanimous bipartisan support. So it's like, you tell me who didn't want this, right? Global News did a 4-person debate discussing the pros and cons. They forgot to invite anybody from Alberta and Saskatchewan. So they just had BC and Ontario debating Alberta legislature. It was so ridiculous. And every story I saw was kind of in parallel with that. So look, like that's how I feel about the performance, but it gets back to that's if you're paying attention to legacy media, who has been incentivized a certain way very recently. And so what else can you expect, And there were some great counter pieces of content. Premier Smith went on the Jordan Peterson show, for example, and gave an amazingly deep walkthrough of where she's coming from and why. And I just think it's a piece of content that every Canadian should watch. It's very, very important. And thankfully, the Odd platform is creating content like that, right? I also had the opportunity to sit down with former Premier Christy Clark of British Columbia, and just get her take, as a former politician. And it was really interesting to hear the opinion of a former Liberal premier discuss the exact same issues worded almost the same as Brad Wall, right? Former Conservative premier. And it just shows how the country has shifted in terms of what you might have called left and might have called right back in the day. I joke with my friends. I'm like, I feel like I've been in the center my whole life and I haven't changed, but suddenly I'm way over on the right, and I swear I'm still standing in the same place. But the spectrum's just gone up and ran away. So I use that example, and I say that I'm not surprised by the coverage, but I use that example because I think it's a perfect demonstration about what we can expect. And once we know what we can expect, it's totally fine, right? That's how incentives work. It's kind of the makeup of the media landscape right now. And knowing it is what it is, just govern yourself accordingly, right? We are a democratic country and have the power to exercise our civil liberties and create change in this country. And I'm very optimistic about our future. Like, I have 3 super young children, and I want them to grow up in this country. I'm looking forward to raising them in this country. And a lot of what I said today, I feel like it's kind of painting a bleak outlook for Canada. I don't feel that way. I don't. I think there's concerns that we need to raise our voices about right now. Absolutely. And I'm happy to do it. And I know many others are as well. But long term, I'm very, very optimistic about raising my children in Canada. I feel incredibly fortunate, right? Like I've always said, I don't feel super proud to be Canadian. I don't, because I'm proud of things I accomplished, and I had nothing to do with the founding of this country. I'm lucky to have been born here, right? Really fortunate. So therefore, I feel an obligation to pay that luck forward, and make sure the next generation, which are my kids, get that same opportunity. But that's how I feel about it.
I'm glad. Me too. I love Canada and I love Alberta. You'll have to come visit soon.
Yes, it's been too long. Yeah.
Yes. Also curious about what you'd like to see for leadership for Canada.
Good question. I would like to see practical strategy and vision. I think that globally, I think that we have absolutely entered a new world order, if you want to call it that. And what that means is that my whole life has been the era of increased globalized economies, right? More coordination, more cooperation, whatever you need, you can buy and sell on the global marketplace. There was enough trust, fragile as it might have been in times, there was enough trust to buy and sell whatever you needed from whoever you wanted. Metals from the Yukon and Peru, manufacture that iPhone with those metals in China, ship it back to the US with, on a shipper with gas bought from Russia or Saudi Arabia. Like, that's the global marketplace. And that area is definitely coming to an end. And that's normal. That's normal cyclical relationships, I think, from a geopolitical standpoint. And as a consequence, Canada should get very serious about what we can offer the world, because turns out it's a lot, Canada is an absolute breadbasket. It was our resource economy that led Canada through the 2008 financial crisis, with the, Economist magazine saying Canada's going to come through this stronger than any other G7 nation. And we went into it strong, right? We had, I think, very pragmatic and practical leadership and strategy back then. We went into the global financial crisis having recently dropped the federal debt by 92 billion over the previous 12 years. Hold that up against going into 2020, we had doubled the federal and provincial debt in the previous 12 years to 1.5 trillion. And the IMF was claiming Canada was going to take on more debt than any other industrialized nation. I mean, we went from far one end of the spectrum in 2008, right? As far as we could down the other side. And it just comes down to sound fiscal governance, right? You got to balance the checkbook. You can never get away from that.
Right.
And so what I'd like to see in leadership is a bit of understanding of that, right? I'd love to see more business people, more entrepreneurs in politics, to be honest with you. A good friend of mine, Ken Sim, just won the Vancouver mayoral election. And, I'm so proud of him because he didn't have to do that. He's a very successful entrepreneur, founder of Nurse Next Door, multinational organization. He could sit on a beach for the rest of his life, but he feels so passionate about Vancouver and the city he wants his kids to grow up in. He's doing this. But the point is, like, Ken's had to make payroll for the last 30 years. He understands that hard decisions are required, and what you do today affects tomorrow. And you can't mortgage your future to pay for today forever. You can't do that. And I think that's what we've been doing in Canada, is we've been, mortgaging the future of the next generation in order to provide empty promises of today. And there's a lot of lip service and a lot of virtue signaling from the top, and it troubles me because it sets a bad example. That's kind of why it bothers me, right? I look at the way that Canadian leadership has demonized the fossil fuel industry and put renewables up on a pedestal. Well, look, I am all for renewable energy. I'm not just saying that lightheartedly. I've got 3 young kids. I spend a majority of my life in very small communities surrounded by wilderness. I'm very in touch with what we stand to lose if we don't take care of our environment. Probably more than most Canadians, to be honest with you. And yet, what's the practical, pragmatic strategy towards renewable power? Well, we need a ton of lithium and cobalt and silver and copper and manganese and vanadium, and the list goes on and on and on. And do we think it's realistic that the same voices who were shouting down the fossil fuel industry and saying, end this, are suddenly going to pivot and say, okay, and now permit every mine globally so that we can procure the metals we need to build these technologies? It's never going to happen. You just have to think to step 2. Where do we get the ingredients from? Mining. We have to dig them out of the ground. That's where we get everything that wasn't grown on this planet. If it wasn't grown, it was mined. And so if we want to build these technologies, that's fine. I'm into it. But let's not turn a blind eye to how that process occurs, right? Especially at the cost of our competitive nature. Canada, part of my language, but we've got the world by the balls should we choose to leverage our resource economy effectively. Potash, oil and gas, all sorts of metals, right? We're a powerful nation. And so I would love to see that less focus on the fabricated promises that we don't actually ever have to deliver, and maybe get serious here. But what we've got a great country. So good.
We have a great story. We need to say more of it.
Yes, exactly. And it's how it works, right? Like we pendulum leadership. Most countries do.
Most
in
do.
democracies, anyways. We go way over here, then we go way over there.
It's true.
And,
Always a wave.
yeah, so we got to put up with some stuff sometimes, and then,
Agreed. Agreed. Well, I'm with you. I'm still very hopeful. And thank you. I agree. How do you manage your investment portfolio?
Well, I'm kind of old school in that regard. But as you know, a lot of my content is focused on the venture market. I invest in earlier stage companies.
Mm-hmm.
But there's two very distinct barbells to my portfolio, and kind of what I preach and practice, and what my audience therefore participates in, and it's behind a lot of the content we create. But it's called the barbell approach, in that we have one bucket of incredibly secure, stable, boring, safe haven assets. For me, that's physical gold, that's real estate, that's cash, but it's the boring stuff that doesn't really have a lot of volatility, maybe generates some yield, but most importantly, retains its purchasing power. And that makes up about 75% of my entire portfolio. And then that 25%, I'm all in on early stage companies. I like the high risk speculative stuff, and almost nothing in the middle, meaning I'm not really touching the broad equities market. When I say not really, I mean not at all. I just don't feel like it's something I want to participate in right now. Doesn't make sense to me. But being based in Canada, we do lead the world in mineral exploration. 60% of the companies that extract the minerals that the world needs to build, they're based in Canada, and 60% of those are actually based in Vancouver. But Vancouver and Toronto collectively, finance most of the mineral exploration and developments and production that occurs globally. That just means that if you like investing in the commodity sector like I do, you have a massive competitive advantage, because all of the personalities, the companies, the entrepreneurs, legendary investors who have done very well, decade after decade, good market or bad, they're also based here. And so, if you are willing to roll up your sleeves and network and dig into that sector, and there's so many amazing people you can follow in that industry. I have a lot of them on my show. I'm really lucky that I get to connect with so many money managers and entrepreneurs from the commodity sector. It's such an interesting industry. Like, if you invest in commodities, all you're doing is just studying global supply and demand economics, like who has what and who needs what, right? And just trying to figure out that puzzle, who's sharing, who's not sharing, who's sharing with this person, not that person. And that global story is the commodities sector. And that dictates supply and demand, who has it, who needs it, what's the perceived future forecast, and why, what may disrupt that. And it's a very interesting narrative and story to follow. And so being an investor in the commodity sector, which is where I spend 85% of my time, is fun, because it's like a never-ending novel. It's kind of like the Game of Thrones series, where there's always jockeying for power and resources, and being positioned here in Canada gives you an absolute competitive advantage in terms of insiders' knowledge as to which companies are competitive, which companies are getting financed, which companies are acquiring new properties, and where and why, and all of this. But that's a lot of what I talk about on the YouTube channel. So my YouTube channel is very focused on investing in the commodity sector. My newsletter, as you know, is more broad-based, not so much managing money, but managing my mind as an investor, which is the first step, I think. That's more what I write about. But on my YouTube channel, I sit down with money managers, entrepreneurs, peer investors, and we just um, you know, chat about where money is being directed. We've seen like record central bank allocations to physical gold in the last year. Record, 40-year records of central banks all over the world buying physical gold and storing it, no longer, and not only buying physical gold, but historically countries like Germany and France would buy physical gold, but they'd store it in New York. And now they're actually repatriating that. Not only are they buying physical gold in record quantities, but they're also repatriating the gold that they own that's not within their borders. The interesting part about that is that the reason Germany and France and many European countries store their gold in London and New York is because the continent of Europe always erupts in war, very recurringly, right? It's a whole bunch of countries sharing one little landmass. Like they're gonna squabble, and they always do. They are right now. Yet, real hot war occurring not that far away, and they're repatriating that gold that they used to store overseas to protect from war. And so it tells you a lot about how countries are feeling in terms of global security right now, right? And back to what I said about, are we in some kind of a new Cold War? I say absolutely. And we have no idea how the cards will fall, but look at the activity of central banks. They're preparing. That's their version of battening the hatches. That's building the moats around the castle. That's what physical gold does. It's a boring asset that's retained purchasing power for, the rise and fall of market cycle, well, the rise and fall of empires. I mean, that's what gold does for your portfolio. So it's interesting to watch that activity at the highest levels in the biggest funds and say, if they're buying physical gold in record numbers, what are they seeing, right? And maybe that's why, I have my highly speculative bucket over here, but the majority of me right now and my family's net worth is tied up in rocks and dirt.
That's awesome. When is your next or when's your next conference? Do you have one coming up soon?
We do. Yeah, we're back in Vancouver, British Columbia with the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference. January 21st and 22nd is the third Sunday and Monday of January. Let me just double check. Those are the correct dates, but everything's up on cambridgehouse.com. We put all of our events there. Yeah, I nailed it. 21st and 22nd. Back in Vancouver. And this is where I got the opportunity to sit down with former Premier Brad Wall, former Premier Christy Clark, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, former President of Mexico Felipe Calderon. It's so much fun. It's such the conversations that we get to have on stage are just, they're mind numbing. I'm often sitting there like, how did I end up in this situation? And it's super fun. And so in January, we're going to have more of that. There's a lot of global outlook. We're ironing out the keynote roster right now, but I guarantee you it's going to be a barn burner. And last year was, and this year will be. And what we do is, I try to start super, super high level. So understand sort of global macro. And that's why I invite various former political leaders, and former political leaders are always better because they're way less censored, they care less. So, yes, what they'll say. And by the way, Prime Minister Harper was absolutely amazing. And, I've been fortunate to interview a lot of politicians. And you never know what you're going to get. Just keynotes in general, any high level names, you never know what you're going to get. And he answered all of my questions with direct answers. He didn't dance around. He's a former prime minister. Like I knew if he didn't like my question, he was going to be able to dance circles around me, and I never would have caught it. I mean, come on, But he was so transparent and authentic and just direct. And wasn't scared to call people out if he felt like there was behavior occurring within leadership that he didn't like and he thought that we should be cautious of. He wasn't scared to call out what he thought we needed in this country. Anyways, it was just fantastic. So, but this January 21, 22, and Vancouver, BC, 2 days, we have about 80 keynote speakers, 500 mining companies, commodity companies that are all investment opportunities. That's what this show is primarily, if you want exposure to the commodity sector. And then about 6,000 attendees will be there. And it's super fun. It's super fun.
Well, I know I loved it, and I was grateful to have the introduction to it. That was my first time when we connected. So thank you, Jay. Thank you for your service. Thank you for choosing Canada, for raising your family. And I'm grateful that you're here and that you took time to share some of your expertise with us today.
course. Pleasure's all mine, Catherine. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Everyone, Jay Martin with Cambridge. Please check out the links that we will send with his YouTube and, of course, the conference that's coming up in Jay. You won't want to miss it, or in January. You won't want to miss it. Thanks again for joining.
My pleasure. Thank you.